And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Chelsea Odhner, who is the Vice President of Publishing for the Swedenborg Foundation and an expert Q&A panelist from the Off the Left Eye YouTube channel, which is also about Swedenborg's information. Chelsea, thank you so much for being my guest today and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
All right, if you don't mind, can we first talk about your lucid dream where you encountered your deceased mother?
Yes. So my mother died when I was 10 years old of a glioblastoma, so one of the most aggressive forms of brain cancer, inoperable. She was diagnosed in May and she died in November, so a 6-month fast decline. And so I was 10 years old, and I have been raised with this Swedenborgian viewpoint of understanding the reality of the afterlife, that it's right there and that there's no time between when our spirit stops living in our body, then it becomes awake to the next life at the time of death. And so I had this sense of, I know she's around. And I don't know if that prepared me in a way for these dreams that I had, but I think it was the summer after she died, but over the course of that next year, I actually had a series of lucid dreams of my mother. And I would go through, it was an interesting experience, even as a child. Like, I remember it so vividly. I would be in a dream, and then I would come into lucidity and then have some awareness about my mother, that I could find her. How it started was, I had been having this dream of going to Burger King with friends, and I had this burger, and somehow this like stone staircase opened up in my house, and I went down into this dungeon, and somehow I had this sense of, I know if I leave this burger for my mom and I come back and see if it's been eaten, then I know I can find her. I know I can connect to her. It was some weird perception around that. And so I had another dream where I came into lucidity in my dream and went and found that same sort of secret staircase in my house and went down into it and found crumbs, evidence that my mom had come and had this food that I had left for her. And I was so excited, and I came running back up the stairs to find her, knowing like she's somewhere, her spirit is somewhere in the house. And in actual fact, I knew that night my dad had a group over and they were meeting in our living room. And so I distinctly felt like I knew I was still asleep in my bed in my bedroom, but my spirit was moving around my house. And I went into the living room and saw my mom, her in spirit, leaning over the back of the chair, I think where my dad was sitting, and sort of listening in on this friendly, conversation that was going on. And she looked and saw me, and there was this excitement of like, we noticed each other. And then these dreams kept happening where it would be like she would come to our house, and I would come into lucidity in my dreams and know that she was there and go find her. And there were a couple different places in my house where she was. And as this series went on, when I would see her, she seemed to change. Like, when I first saw her, she was very much like her healthy self at the age that she was when she died. So before she had the brain cancer. And then the next time I saw her, she seemed to glow, and her hair had gone from like a darkish reddish brown to more of this like golden orange that almost was shining. And when she spoke to me at this next time that I saw her, her voice came out like chiming bells. And yet I understood what she was saying to me. And she was talking about, in that moment, she was saying, you can't hug me right now, actually, like, because of, I guess my sense was because of the state that she was in, like, and I was too much of an earthly state and she was in much more of like this heavenly state. But she intimated to me in that moment, like, meet me in the next room. So we go to the next room, and she was there and had sort of the glow had come down somewhat. And I knew that I was allowed to run and hug her at that moment. So I remember running and hugging her. And there wasn't a lot that was covered in these moments of interaction. It was just like seeing her, having a sense of connection. And that was so meaningful. And then this whole series sort of culminated in me having this, unlike anything else, it was more of like a spiritual experience, or I even describe it, it's like so similar to some near-death experiences that it seems beyond just a lucid dream, where I remember going to sleep, feeling very tired, and it was actually in the middle of the day. I was taking a nap. And as soon as I went to sleep, I remember waking up and being in this grove, this sort of clearing in the middle of a forest. And my mom was there. And so at this time, it was clearly not my house anymore. I was in some other reality. And I woke up and was so happy to see her, and hugged her, and she welcomed me. And then her body started lifting up into the air, literally. And she sort of started drifting off. And I was like, wait, you can't leave me. Like, I don't even know where I am. Like, don't leave now. But she said, don't worry, I'll let you know where you need to go. And so she sort of disappeared, and I was in this deep, thick forest that since then I've seen pictures of like forests in Germany, and that's like the closest to what this forest looked like to me, which was like these trees very close together and their roots intertwined, moss covered ground. And I saw a path through the woods. So I thought, okay, I'll just start walking along this path. And I came to a split in the path, a fork in the road. And I had this feeling of like, I don't know where to go. Where should I go? And I heard her voice behind me saying like, go to your right. So she had come back, and I was like, okay, this is how she's going to communicate with me, as some sort of telepathy. And so I went to the right, and this happened like 2 more times, where I'd come to a split and I'd have to sort of trust, like, she's going to let me know which way to go. And then when I did it, like, I think the 3rd time, I was walking down this narrow path, and then I just saw the path was getting eaten up by this bright light, this golden white light. And I just had this feeling like, this is terrifying, but if I keep going, I'm going to walk right into this light, and I don't know what's on the other side. But I just sort of had this feeling of the inevitability. Like, I couldn't stop. I wasn't about to turn around. So I'm just like walking into this light, and I become completely enveloped in it. And I couldn't see anything. Like, I went through a process of like, it was too bright to even see. And so my eyes slowly started adjusting. And I remember, so my mom appeared out of the light coming towards me, and she was the most distinct of anybody I saw. But I got to, hug her and be with her. Like, it really felt like I was coming to wherever she was. And then these beings of light started forming out of the light around me. They came around, like we were all, like a gathering was happening. And as like a single being was coming out of the light, as it got closer, it would look like 2 people. And then there was this sense of like, okay, everybody's here. And that was when the dancing started, when we all started dancing. And like, the idea was that I was coming, like, that was just what we were going to do, was dance together. So I remember having this glorious time dancing with my mom, dancing around in circles, and this going on for a long time. And I noticed to my right that there was this sort of throne of light, and way up on top of this throne of light was this being who I understood to be God, the divine. And what I distinctly remember was that this being had bare feet, and they were kicking back their feet and laughing with joy. And they reached down into their lap and threw these rose petals up into the air. And the rose petals came and, came down around all of us dancing. And it was just like the most total joy I, had ever experienced. And then after a time, the dancing came to an end, and there was this rain that started to fall. And it was like light everywhere. There was no landscape. It was just like light up above, light around us, light everywhere. But this rain started falling that rather than pooling on the ground, it would just get absorbed into the light or into our skin if it fell on us. But it was like this calming, like, okay, we're settling down now, sign, essentially. And so when things were ending, the being started moving away and merging back into the light and leaving just me and my mom. And I said, I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave you. But she said, I have to leave. And this is the last time you're going to see me for a long time. It was as if all of these dreams, I had sort of had some connection with her. As I understand it now, she was progressing in her own state in the spiritual world as she was connecting more deeply into heaven. And so at this point, it was like this sense of our states aren't going to allow us to communicate directly. And I had this intense sense of foreboding that things were going to get very dark in my life, so dark that I wouldn't have any connection to heaven for a long time. But she told me, you're going to be okay. And at that point, that being up on the throne of light reached down, lifted me up with its hands. And I was like as small as its palm, I could fit in its two hands, and lifted me up into their lap, and then laid this blanket of light over top of me. And I basically snuggled up with like the most deep sense of safety and fell asleep in this state, in this place, and then immediately woke up, in the natural world, in the material world, having had this dream. And it was so remarkable. And I've never forgotten it. And it was like, I never did have another dream of her. I sort of had this clear sense of like, that was it. And like I said, I was 10 at the time. So, my whole process and like development as a teenager, like things did get dark through my teens and 20s, and just intense life stuff. And it's been this interesting coming back to it, or even affirming the reality of it, the truth of it, like knowing that it was true for me. Like I definitely could have questioned it at times, but it felt so real that it was like, this was an experience. I got to meet my mom, and see her on the other side. And so then interestingly, the few times that she has now since appeared to me since I've been an adult, and a part of me feels like I needed to come into a sense of like confirmation about what I had experienced from my own freedom. Like it couldn't just be true. It was like I had to choose whether I was going to believe that it was true or not. And when I became sort of clear in that in my own development, then I started to have more of a sense of her presence with me, of her appearing to me in dreams and like little snippets coming to sort of offer some perspective or support at different moments. And so it's been a really sort of beautiful thing, all told, that since that time when she first appeared to me.
Those are amazing dreams, and thank you for sharing them with us.
Yeah.
Did these dreams happen immediately after she died?
Like I said, I'm almost certain it was the year after she died, that it was sort of in the months following. And then I know that it was like the summertime when I had that nap where I went into the spiritual world. And so I think it all happened within that first year.
What I like is there was a continuation of the dreams. Like first on one, you put the burger out, and then second was that continuation of, she eating the burger.
Yes. And it was like this back and forth. And some of those details are hazy of like, did I always leave something in that dungeon? And that was sort of our sign. It was sort of this sense of, I didn't know when it might happen, but I sort of knew that for a lot of time, I had this sort of secret delight in sort of expecting to be surprised sometime of like, maybe mom's going to come visit me tonight. And then it happened until it finally culminated in that one dream. Yeah.
Can you tell us how you came to Swedenborg's information?
Yeah. So I was raised in a church denomination that does hold Swedenborg's writings as a source of divine revelation. And so Swedenborg, he was writing in the 1700s. he didn't start a church himself. He was really about publishing these books that he wrote for the sake of the church at large, like everybody in the world, and then specifically kind of targeting issues that he saw in the Christian church of his day. But very shortly after his death, people were reading his material and finding like, wow, this changes how I understand things. I want to connect with other people who are reading this. Let's, sort of worship circles, devotional circles started evolving. And so then there was a church that organized around his material in England. And then shortly thereafter, a church organized in America as well. And so that's had a history. And so that I've had, my father and two grandfathers were ministers in this church. And so like I said, I was raised with these teachings, but even Swedenborg writes about this process of what he calls the difference between like historical faith and true faith, that like it's good for us to be raised with some sort of spiritual like container of ideas that help you understand the world, but it's not true. It's not authentic until you're choosing it, as an adult, making sense of it, like, scrutinizing it, deciding, is this really what I believe or what else do I believe? And so the beliefs that we choose authentically are what really make up our faith, like our true faith. And so I feel like I went through a process where I sort of distanced myself from the faith I was raised in to such an extent. I remember feeling like this one concept that Swedenborg writes about, which is called divine providence, which is like this sense of there being a divine, like there is a divine, and this divine has this omniscience that can guide everything in the universe toward good. That was sort of this like key principle that I held on to. And that was kind of it. Then everything else was sort of up to, be sort of thought through and turned over. And I love studying different religious traditions. I've done a lot of studying of yoga philosophy and Buddhism, and I've come back to Swedenborg. It was in my 20s that I started reading Swedenborg's books for myself, and not really just how they were taught to me. And it was through that kind of testing the ideas in my own spiritual life that it became a living thing for me. It wasn't just like, well, this is what we believe. It was like, these are these ideas that help me make sense of my life and make sense of what's going on and give me, empowerment and agency in my life and in my own mind, especially, just like the craziness of everything in life, inside and out. And so yeah, they've really become this lens through which I see the world and understand things. And that's, so I work for the Swedenborg Foundation, being able to support, it's a independent nonprofit that just supports access and, reach of Swedenborg's ideas so people can consider them for themselves and find benefit if that's the case. And so that's how I came to it myself.
I was thinking that since I already did a video with Curtis on Swedenborg, I was assuming that everybody already knows who Swedenborg is. But
yeah.
There may be somebody that's brand new to this video today or brand new to the channel since Curtis was here. So I was thinking maybe we should tell people just real briefly who was
Sure.
Swedenborg in the first place.
Great. Yeah. So his name was Emanuel Swedenborg, and he lived from 1688 to 1772, right at the time of the Enlightenment period. And he was a scientist, trained. He was born in Sweden. He lived in Sweden, and he was trained in a university there. And people describe him as a polymath, like one of the world's geniuses, because he was at the top end of many of the fields in his day, like mineralogy, engineering, designing mines for the Sweden economy. Anatomy was one of his favorite things. He was really, and chemistry, studying that. He even had a part in establishing the Royal Academy of Sciences in Sweden. And he even created the first academic journal in Sweden, this first scientific journal. And so then in his, and he was also ennobled by the Queen at one point, his whole family was. So he was born with the last name of Svedberg, but then it became Swedenborg when he was ennobled. In his mid-50s, and he served in the Swedish government on what was called the Board of Mines. So it was like the people who managed all the mines in Sweden. He was an assessor of mines. So in his mid-50s, he was doing, again, I said his interest in anatomy. He was wanting to find the seat of the soul and studying the brain. He made advanced discoveries about the way the brain works that weren't later confirmed for 50 years, 100 years, 150 years later. Like he described neurons before anybody even knew what electricity was. While he was studying for the seat of the soul, he started having dreams. He started having these, he couldn't ignore them, these like intense spiritual experiences in his dreams. He would write them down in a journal. And so we have this record of his journal of dreams. So just interesting that connects with our topic, which is the largest and like intact document of dream journaling, the oldest one that we have extant in the world, as far as I know. Like it's the oldest, biggest collection of somebody writing. His dreams weren't just what his dreams were happening, but how he would understand them. So you can sort of study his dreams. And a psychologist named Wilson Van Dusen did this in the like 1980s, I think, kind of tracked how did Swedenborg interpret his dreams. And then he had this vision of connecting with the divine, and he was raised Lutheran, and so God was Jesus Christ and appeared to him, and it was after that he had this sense of like he was all about serving the divine, like he felt like he had this spiritual mission, and that after that his dreams, he started connecting to spirits and angels, and rather than just having spiritual experiences in his dreams, he started being able to interact with spirits and angels in his waking life. And he felt that it was all for this purpose to basically use his scientific background to study the spiritual world and write down what he experienced, because he was like, that's the seat of the soul. It's like our consciousness in our body. And like he describes, one of his works is called The Interaction of the Soul and Body. How does our soul interact with our physical body? And that was his mission, to document that, because one, a belief in the afterlife was falling away, and that posed a lot of harm for human beings to lose that sense of connection with the spiritual world in the afterlife, and then also losing a sense of connection to the inner spiritual truths that are in the Bible. And so he wrote a lot, like he had direct experience with the spiritual world, but he also got that insight into what everything meant through his study of the Bible, and what, like, he describes this like deep inner spiritual meaning. So his first work is called Secrets of Heaven, the first work he published after his spiritual awakening. And these secrets of heaven are what he found through this enlightened study of the Bible, basically. So when he lived, he had open, constant communication with spirits and angels while still living and having a active life in this world for the remainder of his life. And he lived to be 84 years old. And then he passed on. So really remarkable. He published like 18 titles during that time. And those are those works that people study for this spiritual sort of information and everything.
It's interesting that you belong to a church, and there is a church that I guess you would say preaches Swedenborg's teachings.
That's right.
What is the name of the church?
Yes, so there's a number of church organizations now. there is one that's called the Swedenborgian Church of North America, and that's a very liberal Christian organization. And then there's also the church that I was raised in, that's the General Church of the New Jerusalem, is what it's called. And that's a much more conservative church. It has its own unique history that I have grappled with. And then there's basically the keywords you want to be looking out for is the new church. That's often what these churches will refer to themselves as, or something having to do with the New Jerusalem. And that's because those are ways that Swedenborg wrote about this concept of the new church that really, it's really sort of denoting a spiritual era. He was describing like this time when people's spiritual understanding was going to totally grow exponentially. He writes about how it's like he had this vision of a temple, and for him every little detail is symbolic of something. And he writes about how he says, now it is permitted to enter with understanding into the mysteries of faith. So he describes that sort of for a lot of, we're all sort of connected and interconnected, and sort of there's been, you could say, spiritual pollution sort of interfering with our ability to access the reality, spiritual truths about heaven. But that when he was writing, he was saying this is a time when this is all going to change, and there's going to be a lot more just light from the spiritual world coming into human minds, and being able to sort of reawaken this connection between us in this world and the communities in the spiritual world and heaven and everything.
From what you were saying, it sounds like there's already different interpretations of Swedenborg's work, because there's a conservative and a liberal.
Exactly. It's so fascinating. And even at the beginning, right after Swedenborg wrote his works, there was a lot of wrestling between different groups about whether to start a church at all. And there were people who were called non-separatists at the time who were like, let's not try to force people to separate from their churches, from like the organizations and faith that they already have, because if you do that, that's actually sort of tarnishing Swedenborg's whole point, like what he was about. So there are people who are really strongly against having any sort of devoted organization, I think, for fear of sort of claiming that was the new church, rather than having this much larger sort of cosmic sense of what the new church was in the world. So really interesting.
It seems
I'm a history person. I love studying the history, so I find it super fascinating.
It seems like you're on the side of the liberal interpretation.
Yes. Yes, I am. And even I wonder about, I've always been interested in what Swedenborg writes about, how even, I sort of think of it as like, Swedenborg is writing about spiritual reality. And this spiritual reality is what you can come into an understanding of through any faith tradition. Like if it's spiritual reality and it is the divine, then the divine is revealing itself to us all the time. And so sort of faiths and different religious traditions are different ways that we understand, and can connect to God. So it's a really interesting position for me to be in. I feel a little bit like an independent, rogue agent, if you will, or something, because on the one hand, my faith is certainly very informed by Swedenborg's teachings. So that's sort of like my religious identity. And yet it's sort of way beyond that. It's like so much more, because it's sort of a more universal perspective. So.
Since Swedenborg wrote about dreams, how would he analyze your dreams, or what would be his interpretation? Would he think that you really met your mother, or it was just your imagination?
Yes. Oh, great question. Swedenborg writes about there being different types of dreams, and interestingly, his own example suggests even a fourth dream. But he describes one that he calls prophetic visions. So that's how he describes, this is what people in the Bible were experiencing. The prophets was like, whether you're in a wakeful state or in a sleep, there's sort of these prophetic visions that are revelatory. They are giving you revelation or telling you of things to come. And again, that sort of revelation depends on our ability, the kind of spiritual pollution, you could say, that can kind of get in the way and gunk up the communication routes. But that's one kind. The other kind, he says, are what are called spiritually instructive dreams. So we have dreams that might present us with different scenarios, but there's sort of a lesson, a very personalized instruction for our own lives through the dream, through the symbology of the dream. The other type is we can basically sort of overhear spiritual conversations or conversations that spirits and angels are having, but it kind of gets filtered down into our subconscious and kind of adapts or adopts the ideas or pictures in our own memory. But so he experienced saying he was having some weird dream, but he was able to become lucid in his dream. And in his case, he had open communication with angels and spirits. And he describes being able to have conversations with the angels and spirits that could confirm for him that, yeah, we were talking about this, and that totally just gave you that dream you just had. So that's, but he does describe that there are so we're very, sort of the backdrop of all of this is that we're very connected to the spiritual world, and that our minds, we couldn't even actually think or feel anything if it weren't for our connection to angels and spirits. That's something Swedenborg learned through his experiences that he writes a lot about. And so knowing that, and he gives a word for that. He wrote in Latin, and it's a very sort of Latinate word, but he describes it as influx. And so that you can sort of think of that as being inflow, that our thoughts and feelings are actually the result of this continual inflow from the spiritual world into our consciousness. And we still have our own sense of self, our own thoughts and feelings, but it's this whole machinery, if you will, for how it's interacting with spirits and angels, and how communities in the spiritual world sort of influence each other. And so our dreams are also interconnected with that network. And so I think, for my experience, that Swedenborg would just be like, yep, that's definitely you connecting with your mom. I think he would probably say there was imagery, like it would be interesting to understand, why were they rose petals, that were falling around us, and what was that rain all about? But because it's all about, there is symbology going on, but he certainly also talks about being able to, that actually part of the design was for our community to extend beyond this world, so that even as we're growing up in this world, we're aware of sort of the spiritual mentorship that we can have, that's available to us through spirits and angels, and angels of heaven, especially, who are wanting to help us grow and develop as, into our truest selves. And he describes that was a much more commonplace thing in sort of ancient civilizations, he says, on Earth, where if you weren't already just having waking life interaction with angels and spirits in your life, they would come to you in dreams, and you would get spiritual instruction or like advice. One of the other times that my mom appeared to me in my dreams later on in my late 20s, I think, was I was really stressing about something that was going on in my life. And I sort of saw her in this room in my house, and she just did this littlest sort of thing where she sort of like threw her head back and acted like so over exaggeratedly, like, oh, how horrible it is that what you're going through, that like this simple action spoke so much to me about how it was like, just like, take it easy, Chell, you don't have to be so worried, it's gonna be okay, like kind of shake it off. And so I love hearing about people, like, I just think that that's sort of a resource that is designed to be available to us, that the angels, loved ones who have passed on, kind of want to help us cope with life. And dreams, Swedenborg even gives sort of a framework for why it would happen through dreams, is because when we're awake in this world, our senses are attuned to physical things. Like, I have to kind of know how the physical world works. Like, how to accelerate and decelerate in my car, the fact of like how this equipment works. But that attention to the physical world kind of shallows or mutes our awareness of the spiritual inflow that's going on from the spiritual world in our minds. And that's why meditation is so beneficial. But then in dreams, it's a pre-designed time when our focus on the physical world goes dormant, and then we can be awake to the spiritual realities around us.
Are you saying that Swedenborg believed that dreams are necessary for our spiritual growth?
Yes and no. I think they're available to us to be a resource for our spiritual growth. He describes, and a term that Swedenborg uses for spiritual growth it's a very sort of Christian sounding word, but it's regeneration, or this process of rebirth. So but you could think of it as just like our own spiritual awakening, like our process of growing up and developing into our true self. And the divine is always leading us in that process, whether we're kind of awake to it or not. And so that, and the point of any regeneration, what that really is, according to Swedenborg, is connecting to love and wisdom, but specifically uniting those two in ourselves. Like the divine itself is the union of love and wisdom together. Swedenborg says, like divine love and divine wisdom that are one. That's the divine. That's God. And so as we unite love and wisdom together in ourselves, and in our lives, that's us opening up to heaven, opening up to a divine inflow. And so through just the experiences of our life, we're all being guided toward uniting love and wisdom in our lives. And that can be accomplished through a very simple life. It doesn't require a whole lot of spiritual gymnastics, but we do have dreams and other experiences available to us, resources that, as much as we want to engage in that process or wake up to these inner levels of our mind, that's possible. So I wouldn't say it's totally necessary, but it's like, it's an advantage, and it is awesome. Like if that's your cup of tea, you can go really deep there. But if you're sort of, no thanks, it doesn't like cut you off from, being able to connect to love and wisdom in your life.
What about nightmares? Did he say anything about those?
Yeah. So he says some interesting things about nightmares. Well, it's two things mainly. One is that he says we are extra protected in our sleep from the attack of evil spirits, but that evil spirits would love to be attacking us in our sleep, but so that angels and angelic spirits or whatever are sort of protecting us around that. And then he also describes a kind of dream that he calls sort of delusions. And I don't know if he means sort of like hallucinations or what that is. So he's never like quite saying the word nightmare. I mean, he's also writing in Latin in the 1700s. So you sort of have to do some piecing together. And so I've come to this, what I find is a really satisfying perspective on nightmares from what I've studied in Swedenborg, which is that they are almost the most potent vessels for spiritual information for our lives. Like sometimes, dreams can be the best wake-up call for us. And I've used this practice in my own life where when you have a nightmare, what you really are experiencing that feels so horrible when you wake up from it are the feelings that are still reverberating in your body. So if you're just gripped with fear, or terror or whatever that is, you're so in the feeling of it. And I take that as a message to pay attention, because first of all, you're safe, right? Like even if it was this crazy convincing dream, chances are you're actually just safe, and you have to wait till those feelings calm down in your nervous system. And but it's enough of a feeling that it's almost like your body being like, pay attention, don't forget this. It's like a really clear, you sort of can't ignore it. You can't just like, oh, whatever, that was a weird dream, let's forget about it. So I use the feelings as like let's pay attention to this. And I might write down everything that happened in the dream thoroughly, but then I wait to look at it until those feelings are gone. They're out of my body, because then I can reflect on the dream from a spiritual perspective, without being just in the terror of it. And when I've done that, so then when I go through my dream and I ask myself, like, what is this telling me about my life? And especially about that, like the goal of everything, which is to unite love and wisdom, which is also to say, to sort of clear ourselves of falsity, or evil is a word you can use, which can really just mean like ways that you're harming yourself or other people, like what's this guy, what guidance could be available in this dream. And so often, I don't know, if you think back on a nightmare after the feeling is over, it just is so absurd. It's almost comically ridiculous. Like, first of all, why was that even scary to me? So often the imagery is like sort of just silly or something, but for some reason in the dream, it really scared you. And it's usually really bizarre. But when I sort of take those images and then wonder, like, what is it telling me about my life? I've found really, really perceptive, really clear instruction or communication or guidance around, like, here's this thing in your life, and maybe you're trying to deny it, but this is what's going on in your life right now. Like really the most powerful mirror for my life. And so it's certainly possible, like, people might be concerned, how do you know if you're getting the right message? Like, what if you're, spiraling off into just false interpretation, of your dream? And I would say, remembering that main thing of how could I use this dream to teach me more about how to unite love and wisdom in my life, like how to connect to what's most loving in life, or a wisdom could really just mean like an awareness, a true perception of what's going on. And then also trusting that concept I said of like divine providence, like knowing that God's going to take care of leading you through whatever this is. And so if you're uniting those things, like thinking about wanting to create this trajectory towards uniting love and wisdom, then whatever the details are that you come up with, it's going to be helpful for your life. And you might find that these dreams, these weird things that are happening inside your head, are actually like very well attuned, very precise. They know you to your core, and even know how you're maybe lying to yourself. Like, so often nightmares wake you up to like, oh, I've just really not been wanting to acknowledge that in my life, but I really can't anymore. And I know that it would be good if I like change my behavior or something in a relationship or whatever it is. So that's, and I guess one note to that is that the word that describes everything of what we do with our dreams is reflection. We reflect on our dreams. And Swedenborg says that the way that ancient peoples on our earth had open communication with angels and spirits was through their reflection on physical things around them and their own dreams, the own images and things that were arising in their consciousness. So that is sort of our pathway of, connecting to heaven, connecting to the divine, and continuing on our journey.
I felt like from your story or your experience that you had a period of self-doubt about whether the dream was real or not. And then at some point you came to a realization that it was real. How did you and other people come to the realization that their dreams are real?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, like I mentioned earlier on, what I love about what Swedenborg writes is I feel like he gives us a sense of like, this is spirit, here's how spiritual reality works. And once you sort of have these building blocks in your mind, then you're able to think about spiritual reality in a way, and it just ends up, and life in this world, and it sort of starts making sense, or it has for me. And one of those principles or ideas is like how key our free will is. Like our choice, what we choose for ourselves is really how we like that's like the biggest thing in our lives in this world is becoming ourselves, like becoming or one way I would say it is like becoming who we are in God, like this partnership between the divine and you as this unique expression of divine love and wisdom, that you are this vessel for that. And so because our freedom is so key to us developing ourselves, because if it weren't, anything somebody else says, if we just went along with it, that would be just us, just going along with everybody else and not really having a clear sense of who we are. And so, like I said, when I was studying Swedenborg's works in my early to mid 20s, and I was just like voraciously, like, I just had an insatiable appetite for studying this spiritual information. And something I really got was that nobody's ever going to answer this question for me. Is it all real or is it not real? Nobody's ever, if you think it's real, that doesn't mean anything to me, because that's a choice you've made. And so for me, first of all, we struggle with these questions, like, what is real? Is this all true? Is it all fake? And especially for me, even wondering about what is my religious identity? It's so deeply connected to who we are, is what we believe. And scrutinizing our beliefs, because so often we have beliefs that don't actually make sense, that we maybe don't like, are just carryover from things we were told, and they might actually be, negatively influencing our lives. So the importance of us really going through and then choosing for ourselves, what am I going to believe? That's like key to our development. And nobody can make that choice for you. Like, that's work that you have to do. And so when it came to my experience with my mom, and then even just whole questions of like, what do I think of even what Swedenborg wrote? What do I think of what anybody tells me of what's true, religiously speaking or something? That I got to this point of like, I just have to choose for myself. And and then own that choice, be like, this is what I'm choosing to believe, but then even not gripping to belief, like knowing that the whole idea of what is true is this ongoing revelation that we are experiencing in our own lives, like, because what I thought was true 10 years ago, 15 years ago, my depth of understanding has developed, a lot since then. And so 20 years from now, my sense of what I think is true might change, but I think it's a progression. But the only way we participate in that progression is by like, I'm just going to choose to believe this, and taking that empowered action. And knowing that I have the freedom to reassess, change my mind later, like so I've been participating in that way, like being like, well, I'm going to just see what I think. I'm going to say, this is true for me now, believing in God, believing in the reality of my connection with loved ones in the afterlife, believing in what Swedenborg wrote about the afterlife. And that is a framework for understanding life that has never let me down. It's always expanded my sense of the divine. And yet, like I said about the church I was raised in, there's a lot of sort of teachings I absorbed from that church, even though it was a Swedenborgian church, but I've had to cull what ideas I got from them, in terms of certain ones that are just like, no, that is not, like, I can feel the difference between what kind of shuts my mind down, shuts my life down, and what opens it up and gives more possibility, in connecting me with joy, this sense of, a connection to the divine. And so knowing that there's this process going on where, like, that I can be connecting into those truths, but that's, it's, it's going to be up to you to make the choice, one way, but that can always be an evolution.
Did Swedenborg make his own analysis of the dreams of the Bible? And if so, like, for example, the Pharaoh's nightmares in Genesis, what did he say about that?
He does. And his understanding of those, of a lot of basically the whole Bible, whether it's like somebody saying they had a dream or just the actual story of the Bible itself, it is all very detailed in terms of its what it's conveying on a spiritual level. And so I don't have in mind specifically like Joseph and Pharaoh and those interesting dreams, or like Nebuchadnezzar, but he describes them as being, it's all of the details end up being a story of our own spiritual development. Or then he describes Jesus Christ's process of being born as a human and uniting to the divine in himself. So and those processes mirror each other according to Swedenborg. And so he describes like Jesus studying the Bible and getting insight into the process of connecting with the divine that he was living through. But one interesting example of sort of biblical interpretation, according to Swedenborg, that actually kind of connects to dreams is what Swedenborg says about Moses when he saw the burning bush. And see, this gives you a taste of how specific Swedenborg gets in the details, because he takes it by like phrase by phrase. And so when Moses sees this burning bush, he says, I'm going to go aside and look at this, bush that's burning and it's not being consumed. He sees this, and the story goes that Swedenborg sees this burning bush, goes to it, and then hears God speaking to him through the burning bush. And so Swedenborg says that going aside and seeing means reflecting, reflecting on our own thoughts, actually, even like, so that detail. And that when we reflect on our own thoughts, then we gain perception. And Swedenborg, Moses in the story, he says, I'm going to go inside and see this great vision. And so taken all together, that simple phrase means that when we reflect on our thoughts, we can gain perception about what love and wisdom are, essentially. And that's what's depicted by the flaming light, the light, that the heat and the light is the love and the wisdom. And so anyway, just like a super simple snapshot of how detailed Swedenborg's explication is of the Bible. But I sort of loved that really simple picture of somebody looking aside to this burning bush, and that encapsulating the power that we have to reflect on our thoughts and then gain perception on what love and wisdom really are. Like that's really empowered, that we have that ability to do that, to gain that revelation. I mean, like, revelation is understanding what love really is and what wisdom is. So anyway, that's a thought on that.
Does Swedenborg say anything about near-death experiences? I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't use those words, but, being close to death and having a meeting with the divine or angels and coming back to life.
Yes, that's really, again, such great questions you're asking. And I would say, like, a lot of people have found affirmation and confirmation in their experiences of near-death experiences through studying Swedenborg and what he wrote. One of his most famous works is called Heaven and Hell. And although I'm not sure if Swedenborg describes, near-death experiences, it lines up so much with just what all of us experience when we die, that then you can sort of derive this sense of a near-death experience really being somebody beginning that process of transitioning over, but then coming back, having it not be the right time and that sort of thing. But so what we all experience when we die, Swedenborg described for posterity's sake, being given the experience of dying while some part of his consciousness remaining observant, so he could remember the experience and write it down detail by detail. And so he gets, and that's actually where the name of our channel, Off the Left Eye, comes from, because through this process, he describes what happens when we die. And again, the symbology is there. So we put that at a later point, or I guess sort of the specifics you might need to know is like, similar to being in dreams, he says we're super protected by angels, like the highest angels, and the highest angels mean those that are most connected to love itself, and wisdom itself. And so they offer this protection from any evil spirits coming near us as we transition over. And while we're sort of like having this oneness with angels of the highest heaven and sort of being in this experience of love, that helps us make the transition. And then our consciousness has to kind of come down from that to sort of regain our, turning on our mind again that can, understand language. You're not just in this pure feeling experience of love. When he says that transition from that super love state to being able to see spirits and angels and talk to them, he described this veil or film being rolled off of his left eye. And so sort of then him having this spiritual awareness of being able to see in the spiritual world after that sort of marks the completion of the transition over. And Swedenborg describes it. So everybody wakes up in what he calls the world of spirits, which is a realm that's in between heaven and hell, he says, where it's like everybody, and when you're in the world of spirits, you're bringing all your memory from your life, and you're maybe not fully clear on what you really love, who you really are. And what he says people go through when they're in the world of spirits is very much like many of the near-death experiences, where loved ones greet us. Loved ones are sort of the first ones to be there, to welcome us on the other side. And then also, whether it's loved ones or other people, or spirits and angels who feel like family to us, but we've maybe never even met them, they sort of spiritual kin, they welcome us and then ask us, what do you want to know about? Then there's a whole sort of teaching and instruction time where people can learn and have all these questions answered, which I know is another, common experience in near-death experiences. And so a lot of those different elements, even though he's not sort of making a one-to-one or talking about it explicitly, it all sort of suggests this larger context of like, okay, yeah, if that's how the spiritual world works, then it would make sense that when people get near death, their spirit is able to just sort of transition over, spend some time out of the body. And whether it's really time to go over or not, then they might come back or be transitioning over entirely.
All right, Chelsea. Well, time went by really fast during this podcast, and I need to change gears with you. Your YouTube channel, again, is called Off the Left Eye.
That's right.
If people want to find out more about Swedenborg, what is the website to do so?
Yep, Swedenborg.com. So that's Sweden, like the country Sweden, Borg, B-O-R-G. Swedenborg.com. That's the Swedenborg Foundation's website. And we have one of the projects of the Swedenborg Foundation is, like I said, Swedenborg wrote in Latin. So we have a team of Latin translators who are retranslating Swedenborg's works for a modern audience to be accessible. So a number of, sometimes you're reading translations that were translated into English back in the 1800s or something. And you're like, this isn't exactly, I don't feel a connection happening here. And so these new translations that we're coming out with really kind of clear the way for you to be able to just like have direct access with the ideas that Swedenborg's describing. And all of those books are available on our website. Those are the ones in the New Century Edition that have come out so far, and there's a number of them. And so, yeah, people can explore that there.
Well, you're the Vice President of Publishing, and you appear on the YouTube channel. What else are you doing that you want us to know about?
Oh, let's see. Well, we host an annual event that is called the Off the Left Eye Experience, which we've done it we did it virtually. We were planning on doing the first one in 2020, but then that got canceled. So we did a virtual one last year, but this year we're doing it in person with a virtual option from June 24th to the 26th. And so it's an immersive experiential weekend to think about these ideas and connect with other people and talk about it. And so our theme for this year is the spiritual world around us. And that it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have some great talks and experiences, and it's being hosted, if you want to come in person, it's being hosted in a town called Bernathen, Pennsylvania, that is historically a Swedenborgian town because it has its roots back to those, the history that I was describing earlier on. So one of the interesting hallmarks of Bernathen is it has a cathedral that was built in like 1920s or something, entirely with wanting to like basically create architecture based on Swedenborg's ideas of symbology and all this kind of stuff. So it's a really interesting thing to check out if you're ever coming by this area. But that's where we're hosting, this town is where we're hosting the Off the Left Eye experience. And it'd be great to have anybody come in. Registration, I think, is now live and open. So you can find that either on Swedenborg.com, or we have a website, offthelefteye.com, that also has the information.
If people want to reach out to you and ask you questions, should they do that through your YouTube channel or some other way?
Yeah, so we do have an awesome team of our community care team. So there are people who are always responding to our comments on YouTube. So any video that we have on our YouTube channel, if you leave a comment there, you'll get a response. If anybody wants to connect directly with me, my email is CR.Odhner, my last name, @Swedenborg.com. And so that's also available to anybody.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
I would say it is trusting the process, that our spiritual development, things can happen in life that feel chaotic, that it's going nowhere, that things are getting worse, but that one of the divine's, best tricks is being able to take things that cause our suffering and turn them, almost like turning it into gold, making it become something that's going to bless us with love and with greater wisdom. And that a part of our spiritual growth, it has to go through these alternations of feeling a connection to that love and wisdom, and then not. Swedenborg describes that as like going through phases of cold and heat, just like we do seasonally. And so we have that example around us all the time, and day and night. And so when you're going through day and nights in your life, know that that's exactly the process that's going to help you in your life journey to having fulfillment and happiness.
Chelsea, thank you for that message. I really appreciate you being my guest today, and I wish you the best.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff. It was such a pleasure to get to meet you and talk with you. And yes, this time flew by. It was so much fun.
Likewise. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.